listening to the Booktrospective podcast, a podcast for all types of books. And even though we read all types of books across all different types of genres, we want to give a disclaimer. Many of our books and a lot of our content sometimes is intended for mature audiences. And we don't believe in censorship, but we do want our listeners to have the opportunity to decide if our episode or podcast is good for them. So with that, let's get into the episode. Quick editor's note. I kept calling the character Bugesh, and it's Rugesh. And as you guys know, I generally listen to the audiobook. And so that is what I heard, and it is Rugesh. And I realized that afterwards. So please do not flame me. I am so sorry. Hey, it's Dominique.
And Keely.
And you are listening to Booktrospective. And this week we are covering Middle of the Night by Riley Sager.
Woo!
And I already know how Keely's week was because we are doing this right after the last episode. So we actually don't have anything to talk about, so we're going to just go right into our episode. We don't have any updates, but if you're not following us on all of the socials, make sure you're following us on Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram at Booktrospective, and check out our website at booktrospective.com. So, Keely, do you have the blurb?
I do. In the latest jaw-dropping thriller from New York Times bestselling author Riley Sager, a man must contend with the long-ago disappearance of his childhood best friend and the dark secrets lurking just beyond the safe confines of his picture-perfect neighborhood. The worst thing to ever happen on Hemlock Circle occurred when Ethan Marsh's backyard. One July night, 10-year-old Ethan and his best friend and neighbor Billy fell asleep in a tent set up on a manicured lawn in a quaint New Jersey cul-de-sac. In the morning, Ethan woke up alone. During the night, someone had sliced the tent open with a knife and taken Billy. He has never been seen again. 30 years later, Ethan has reluctantly returned to his childhood home. Plagued by bad dreams and insomnia, he begins to notice strange things happening in the middle of the night. Someone seems to be roaming the cul-de-sac at odd hours, and signs of Billy's presence keep appearing in Ethan's backyard. Is someone playing a cruel prank, or has Billy, long thought to be dead, somehow returned to Hemlock Circle? The mysterious occurrences prompt Ethan to investigate what really happened that night, a quest that reunites him with former friends and neighbors and leads him into the woods that surround Hemlock Circle. Woods where Billy claimed monsters roamed and where a mysterious institute does clandestine research on a crumbling estate. The closer Ethan gets to the truth, the more he realizes that no place, be it quiet forest or suburban street, is completely safe, and that the past has a way of haunting the present.
All right, if you could describe this book in one word, what would you say?
Oh, gosh. I should have been prepared for this one. I would say that it is one word. I have a word that I'm thinking of, but I can't think of the word. Like, I know what I want to say. It's very... I would say it has a nostalgic... It's nostalgic, kind of.
Okay. I would say... I had a word and I lost it. I was looking at it. They're all kind of the same. But I would say... Dang it. What was the word that I picked? I'm really right at it.
I changed my word.
Okay.
Whiplash.
Dang it. I had a good one I was looking at. Where did I see it? This one's kind of weird. I'm just going to say unfortunate. Because I think there were unfortunate circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So this, as with most of his books, this is like dual timeline, multiple POV. So it takes place, this is present day, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So it's present day, and then like
30
80s,
years.
90s, the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And so essentially our main character, his name is Ethan Marsh, and in the 90s, his best friend disappears out of a tent in the middle of the night that he was sharing with him and was never to be seen again. It has been 30 years to the day, and he is back home, and everything is resurfacing. All of the people who were there at the time of the disappearance are also there again. There's also little things that are popping up that make them, that remind him of his friend Billy.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, he's basically, I mean, that's a whodunit. They're trying to figure
Yeah.
out
Yeah.
where is Billy? What is Billy? Why is Billy? And so, I mean, yeah, so, you know, it's a thriller. There is a not spooky aspect. I don't know what you would call it.
I would say very loosely supernatural.
Yeah,
element.
loosely supernatural. And I don't know, this one I feel like was a little bit different because it was also like made me like a little like sad. Like I was like, oh, yeah, and I'm like, oh man, but it's still a really good book.
Yeah.
And so this one is like more of a recent release. It just came out in July. Triggers.
I'm sure there's triggers. Let me see. Oh my gosh. So I typed in triggers for middle of the night, and it was like reasons this might happen include drinking caffeine or alcohol late in the day, and I'm like, what? By Riley Sager.
Yeah, that little vague.
Mental health, trauma response. We're not really giving many triggers. Nope. Yeah, I would say maybe death, cultish activities, blood.
Yeah.
Missing person. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's the big ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially without giving like
Too
stuff
much
away.
Yeah, too much away. All right. Well, if you have not read this book and you do not wish to be spoiled, this is your warning to pause here and come back later. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So we start in the past. So it is Saturday, July 16th, 1994. I was 2 years old. 2 years and 4 days. But Ethan wakes up in the tent. He is 10 years old, and this is what he considers his last free moment for the next 30 years because he turns over and he sees a slit in the tent, and he is in his backyard, and the person that was with him is gone. And we go to present time. He hears a noise, and he knows it's just in his head because he's taught himself that it's just a memory or a nightmare, and it only returns because he is back in his childhood home. And he was looking out the window, and all of the houses in the neighborhood have automatic lights, and it seems like something is setting off the lights and coming towards his house. And at first he tries to tell himself it's a bat, but they don't move like progressively in that direction. They're like chasing a target normally. So he doesn't think it's that. So he goes downstairs and opens the door, and he stands there knowing that there's no one outside, but he feels the presence that seems familiar to him, and he calls out Billy's name, who is his friend that went missing. Mm-hmm. So Ethan has moved back into his parents' house, and this is in Princeton, New Jersey. Growing up, his friends probably thought that he like hated his parents, but he actually just hated the house because it reminded him of Billy, because like he would never go home. Like after everything that happened, he's tried to spend as little time as possible there. He has severe insomnia. He can never sleep between like 1 and 4 a.m. especially, no matter like what he's tried. He's tried therapy, meditation, etc. He had a therapist who told him he couldn't sleep because he has a guilty feeling like he missed something that night, which he pretty much already knows that. He went to college at Northwestern in Chicago, which that's where my sister went to college. And Claudia was the only person who told everything about, which we'll learn Claudia was his wife. They're estranged, and they were together for 17 years, but they're not currently. And his parents offered to let him have this house because they moved into a condo down in Orlando. And he decides to get on the National Missing Persons database for Billy just to see if there's any updates on his page. But it shows, like the pictures on there, they do the age progressions. It's very weird to like look at him because he's obviously like in the same clothes that he was in the last picture, but they just make him look older. And he thinks how the photos like use his school picture from the year that he went missing, but there's also this picture of him from the 4th of July, which is like a more comforting picture, like him in his like natural element. And it's unfortunate because the pictures that they used of Billy, like when he went missing, they cropped him out of like Ethan out of it. Billy became known as the Lost Boy. And basically Ethan was like never mentioned. So he was kind of just like forgotten in the mix of everything. And also Billy had like a younger brother who was never really mentioned during the whole debacle either. Mm-hmm. And basically, like when the police came that morning, the slit in the tent was found to be like done by a kitchen knife, and the whole neighborhood knives were like tested, and none of them were found to be the correct knife. There were no footprints found because the grass had been recently cut, and it was slit on the side of the tent facing Billy's house, I believe. Mm-hmm. And there was like no struggle, so they were like, they seemed like, basically he probably knew the person who did it. We learned that Ethan's dad is a professor, or he was a professor at Princeton, and like everyone loved Ethan's dad. So like obviously like his dad and Billy's dad were like the first suspects, of course, because they were the nearest men. And they were also like, they ruled out Ethan's dad, and then Billy's dad was tracked down. Like he had been out of town, so like they ruled both of them out. So a year after Billy had been missing, they had a memorial, and he felt like everyone had been staring at him at that because, he was the one who survived. And during like the last 30 years, 7 men have come forward as a kidnapper, even though they weren't. And I always think that this is the strangest thing. And I do not understand why they do not arrest these people and throw away the key, because who in their right mind confesses to a kidnapping or murder that they do not do? Like, I don't know why they allow those people to wander the streets, because something is wrong with you.
You need
to be in a mental institute.
Yeah, psychological help.
Like, they just let them leave, and I listen to true crime all the time, and they'll be like, yeah, they just came in and they didn't do it. Okay, but why do we let them leave? Like, right. Why? Like, that's a really bright red flag.
There's obviously an issue there.
Yeah, I'm not confessing to anything that I didn't do, let alone like murder. Yeah, or anything I do, but definitely not something I didn't do. So, especially when it's like murder or abduction or like any of those things that's really gonna send me to the slammer. So, yeah, my FBI agent.
No, thank you.
Is listening to me and hates me. All right, so we jump back and we actually go to the day before, so Friday, July 15th, and it is 8:36 in the morning, and Ethan wakes up in his room. His dog's at his door, and he's thinking how like he hates that his parents just started letting him shut his door, which like is so funny to me to think like, I don't know if there was a time when my mom started letting me shut my door. But he smells breakfast and he's like, why is my mom home? Like, she's never home, and she's making like her weekend breakfast. And he goes down and he thinks about last night because his mom had left last night. She said she had left something at the office, which he thought was weird. And like he goes downstairs and he's like, what's wrong? And his dad says nothing. And his mom's like, he wants to know why I'm home. And she's like, I don't work there anymore. They don't need me. And Ethan's upset because his babysitter's not going to be coming, which his babysitter's name is Ashley, and he has a crush on her. And Ethan is like, why can't you just like go back? And his mom says, I can't talk about it. And his dad says, or you won't talk about it. And he's like, well, you said you were let go because of budget cuts. So like, what do you mean you can't talk about it? And then outside, Ethan notices his dog is like growling at the woods, which is like really unusual, but he's focused on his parents right now. And he also hears something, and then he sees this baseball roll into the yard, which is Billy's code that he wants to play. And then we go back to present time, and he's had another dream, and he wonders if the dream is a memory or just something that his brain wants him to think. And he thinks about how Billy's mom had like grabbed him in the yard and just like begged him to tell the police what he knew, but he said he didn't know anything. And the lawn guy comes up to the door and he's like, oh, you must like want payment or whatever. But the guy's like, no, like your parents paid for it to cut the grass for the summer, but like you need to let your kids stop leaving stuff in the yard. He's like, I don't have kids. And the man gives him a baseball, and it's old and battered, just like the one that Billy used to have. So we go back in time, and Billy is hiding in the hedges, waiting to throw the ball. And we're in Billy's POV, and that's like his code. And Billy like is very like awkward. He doesn't really fit in with anyone except for Ethan. Going back to current day with Ethan, he knows that this can't be Billy. Like, it's just not him. But he goes across the street to the only place where he knows, like, kids are. And this is to his neighbor, Russ. And Russ is, like, he lives over there with his mom and his wife. And they have two kids? One kid? One or two kids? Can't remember. One kid. One kid and she's pregnant.
Yes.
Yeah. One kid and the wife's pregnant. And so Russ, like, is... like he became like really popular. He ended up being a football player. He was a model growing up. And like Ethan thinks like how he's like basically the same kind of loser basically. But he asked like, hey, did your son Benji, like, you know, is this his ball? And Benji's only like 4, and like, you know, obviously he's like a toddler. He basically has those like giant balls. Like he's not doing anything. And that's when the wife comes out and she's like, no, like he has those big toddler balls or whatever. And he thinks of how, like, Claudia said that she had wanted kids one day all of a sudden, even though they had always discussed it and never wanted kids. And Russ's mom comes out and says how good of a son Russ is, and it makes him think how did she consider her other son to be the bad son, and we learned that Russ had a brother named Johnny who died of an overdose. And Russ mentions, like, there is another family with a son, you know, you should check on the other side of the cul-de-sac, and he's like, who? And he tells Ethan Ashley Wallace is back, and Ashley Wallace was the babysitter, and she apparently has had a son, and she's moved back. And so basically, when Ethan had woken up to learn Billy was missing, he had went to his mom, and she had told him to go over to Billy's house and look for him. And when he had got over there, Billy's mom panicked, saying he's not with you, and now, you know, it's 30 years and he's still missing. So he goes, you know, past Billy's house, and then he goes to the Vanderveer house. And basically everyone in this house, in this neighborhood, has the same family in it except for Billy's house. And at one point in time, he did ask his dad, like, why do you think no one has left this neighborhood? But his dad suspected, like, no one wanted to leave because it looked suspicious for them to move. So, like, no one's ever left. And so as he's like heading over, you know, across the neighborhood, Mr. Vanderveer comes out and says, you're making the rounds this morning. And Ethan says, yeah, did you see where this ball came from? And Mr. Vanderveer's wife's out there, and he's like, hey, can you go out and get me something to drink? And when she leaves, he asks Ethan, like, hey, did you see something weird? But Ethan's like, no, like, he just kind of blows it off or whatever. And so the man asks Ethan, or basically tells Ethan, like, well, by the way, like, tell your mom I said hello. And he leaves, and he's like, well, why would he just say hi to my mom and not to both of my parents? So back in 1994, we were with Ethan's mom, whose name is Joyce. And she is just thinking how she can't tell the truth about why she lost her job. And she goes out, and like basically every morning, like the moms meet it's a cul-de-sac. So they meet out in the cul-de-sac, and the other moms are like asking why she's off. And she just kind of pretends like, oh, you know, I'm just going back to like being a stay-at-home mom like everybody else, because none of the other moms work. And Mrs. Vanderveer comes up, and she wonders like if she knows. And at this point I was like, oh, are you sleeping with her husband? And Mrs. Wallace is out there, and she says, like, you know, I saw a man wandering the neighborhood, looked like he came out of the woods, because there's, like, these woods that butt up against the cul-de-sac. And Joyce, like, tries to excuse the man, like, you know, he's probably not doing anything nefarious, like, he's good or whatever, but they don't think so. And she thinks how, like, I don't want to just be, like, a stay-at-home mom, like the rest of these, like, I want to have potential. And she tries to, like, head back home past Billy's mom, but because she doesn't really want to talk to her, but she stops her, and she's like, you know, do you think it's okay if the boys still camp out tonight? And she's like, yeah, like, don't be silly. And she's like, it's not silly. And she's like, it's perfectly safe, which, of course, she regrets the next morning. And as she goes inside, she sees Mr. Vanderveer outside, and he's just, like, staring at her. And so she, like, awkwardly waves at him, and he just puts his finger to his lips, signaling, like, don't say anything about last night. So we go back to Ethan, present day, and he goes to the Wallace house, and there's a little boy, and he says, this ball isn't his. We hear, he hears Ashley, like, in the house saying, like, tell whoever it is at the door to go away, which is me. But she comes out, and she's like, hey, I used to be your babysitter or whatever. And She starts to go like, oh, I haven't seen you since, but she like trails off because she hasn't seen him since Billy's memorial. And she asks him like, what's he doing here? And he says like, I'm teaching English at the nearby school and I'm staying at my parents' house. And she tells him she's back in town because her dad isn't doing too well. And she's like, yeah, that's not my son's ball. Like, he can barely throw a ball. And her dad comes up and says, like, what's that? And Ashley says, it's a ball, Dad. So Ashley's dad asks Ethan if he saw the neighbor. And he's like, yeah, I saw Russ. And he's like, no, the Behringer boy. And he says he saw him outside last night. And Ashley's like, you just need some rest, Dad. And he's like, no, I know what I saw. I saw him. And Ethan is like, maybe he's right. Like, that kind of supports what I felt last night. And he's like, maybe Billy's alive and he's here. So he goes home and he calls the database of missing people. And he's like asking for an update. And he says, and the person on the other line is like, what have you heard? And basically tells Ethan that yesterday 10-year-old remains were found. Well, remains of a 10-year-old were found in the woods. So Ethan now knows Billy is dead. So he's having a meeting with all the neighbors that like were his friends. So it's Ashley, Russ, him, and a detective police officer comes whose name is Bagesh, which is another kid from the neighborhood who is now a police officer. And he comes and gives them the details. He wasn't really their friend, but he like grew up in the neighborhood. He actually was kind of like the neighborhood bully. And he basically tells them, like, he can't give them much because, like, even Billy's family doesn't know yet. But Billy's mom has been, like, in the hospital for a long period of time. And no one's seen his brother in years. And basically, they found his body near the Institute, which is, like, this facility nearby that, like, no one really knows what they do. Mm-hmm. But it was found 2 miles away at the falls. And Ethan thinks about how as a kid they had been like forbade from going there, but he had been there once, which was the day before Billy went missing, and everyone in the room with him today had been there. So Ashley, Russ, and Bagesh, and Billy. And he asked, like, did Billy fall in and drown? And Bagesh says, like, it looks unlikely. It looks like foul play. Ethan thinks about how one day after Billy's disappearance, Ethan was outside like playing, and Ashley pulled up in a car and asked him to get in. And his mom panicked, thinking like, she was some stranger because obviously Billy was missing. But she saw it was Ashley and she relaxed. And basically she told his mom like, oh, I'm going to take him for ice cream. But when he got in the car, she was like, I want to talk about Billy. And asked like what the adults had told him. And he like told her like, I think he's dead, but no one has said it. And she said that, she gave him a hug and was like, don't think that, like, never give up hope, basically. And now today he's comforting her because she was like crying, saying she had hope this whole time. And he basically asked, like, how did they find him? And basically 2 scientists had been taking samples and they found a bone fragment in one of them. So then they dredged the whole lake and they found his body. And he's like, okay, so why didn't they do that before when he went missing? And apparently, like, the Institute had put a stop to it. And the Institute is owned by this man, or was owned by this man named Ezra Hawthorne, and no one really knows what they do there. It's owned by the government now, but it's kind of like semi-private land. And it had been Billy's idea to go there that day that they had went. And he asked if, like, do you think the Institute, or think that going there that day had something to do with it? And, none of them have ever, like, mentioned that they went there that day because they all kind of felt guilty about how they treated Billy that day. Bagesh says, like, that area is a good dumping ground, but he doesn't really think it has anything to do with the Institute. So Ashley and Russ leave, and Bagesh says, like, Ethan, like, what's really going on? Like, you called me less than 24 hours after this body is found. And Ethan's like, nothing. And this is where we learn, like, Bagesh used to really be, like, a bully. So Ethan basically tells him, like, look, I thought I felt Billy, like, his presence or whatever. And Bagesh is like, do you think someone's messing with you? And Ethan's like, well, who would be messing with me and why? And he's like, I still think it has something to do with that day. And Bagesh says no, because Billy would have never came home that day if it did. And he showed up unharmed. And then, Ethan basically thinks like, and then we had an argument, but we made up. And basically what we'll learn is that they had left Billy alone in the woods as Billy was begging Ethan not to leave him. So he is alone now. Everyone's left. And he calls Claudia and it goes to voicemail. He had texted her earlier saying he had missed her. But so then he calls his mom and she answers on FaceTime and she's like, what's wrong? And he can't really tell them because they'll call the neighbors and they'll tell everybody. So, he just is kind of like checking in. So Russ comes back over and he has some bourbon. And Russ just tells him, like, you know, you need to be careful obsessing about the Institute. You know, he thinks the killer was like that stranger that they said was in the woods. And Ethan apologizes to Russ because when they were kids, they used to leave him out a lot. Like, he was kind of like the third wheel. And Russ asks if he ever, you know, if Ethan ever thinks about his dead brother, Johnny. And he realizes that, you know, this whole thing with Billy has probably brought up Russ's memories. And he realizes, like, no, I really don't ever think about Johnny. And Russ is like, basically like, you know, well, I care just as much about Johnny as you care about Billy. And like the same way that you care about Johnny is the same way I care about Billy. Like, you know, like you don't put enough thought into my brother. I really don't put that much thought into like Billy being missing. And basically like kind of saying like everyone's had losses. So we go back to July 15th in 94 and it's now 10 a.m. And Russ is just thinking about how he misses his brother. So even at this point in the past, like his brother was already gone. And Russ asks his mom, like, you know, why doesn't Ethan like me? And she says, like, he does like you. You just get angry all the time. So he goes upstairs, slamming his door, literally saying, I don't get angry. And I'm like, well, you're proving a point. And, you know, he thinks, like, I can't help it. Like, I just have all these thoughts. And he hates his mom. He hates how she has, like, this stupid accent. And her English isn't good. And the kids make fun of her. Because he's, like, he's Asian, of some Asian descent. And he just wants to be all of the good parts of Johnny. And he looks between Johnny's mattresses and he has all these like magazines of like men working out and like muscles and all of these things. And his mom takes them and he like starts to be really intrigued by them. And he's like, you know, I want to start working out. And I was like, But so we go to the current day with Ethan and he wakes up again from that same dream and he writes down that it's not real. And he goes over to the window and he sees the light turn on at the Wallaces. And then he sees the same thing happening with the light. So he goes downstairs real quick with his phone, debating to call the police. And he goes to the direction, terrified, and he like yelps because he like sees a rabbit. And then he goes to the backyard for the first time in years because he's pretty much like avoided it ever since that day. He considers calling Claudia, but then he realizes how like quiet it's gotten outside. And I'm like, and I would be back in the house.
Yes.
Because I'm like, when it gets quiet, that's a no-no. I'm going inside. But he turns around and there's no one there, but there is another baseball. And he's like, this has to be a joke. So this time it's a different ball. Like, because he still has the other ball. So this is a different ball. Mm-hmm. And he's like, I have to catch who's doing this. So then, like, it's the next day and his doorbell goes off. And it's Ashley and her son, whose name is Henry. And she's like, can you, like, watch him? I need to take my dad to the store. And he's like, you know, I was going to go somewhere. Like, I don't really know anything about kids. But he's like, fine, whatever. So he is going to the store that Russ owns, which is like a sporting goods store, and he takes Henry with him. And so like on the car ride, they're so funny. Like Henry keeps calling him Mr. Marsh, and he's like, you can call me Ethan. And he's like, well, I want to keep it formal. So then Ethan's like, okay, well, should I call you Mr. Wallace? And he's like, no, I prefer Henry. And then he's like, well, I don't even know if his last name is like Wallace, because like he doesn't know like anything about like his dad or like anything. But it's just like Henry's funny. So he gets to the store. Like Russ is obviously hungover. And he's like, hey, I need a camera that, like, captures, like, wildlife. Like, he, like, pretends he's going to, like, watch wildlife. But what he really wants is to, like, watch the backyard. And he, like, walks by a tent, and he's, like, starts to panic. And then, like, Henry pops out of it. And he's like, I don't know. It was really quiet in there, and I can read. But he gets the camera. It's, like, the most expensive one. But he puts it up in the backyard. And he tests it out by having Henry, like, jump in front of it. And it, like, clicks. And it's, like, a really quiet sound. And it immediately, like, pings to his phone, so like it's really quick. And Henry's like, why are you getting this? And he's like, you know, I think someone's been in my backyard. And he asks if, you know, he's seen anyone around their house, and he says no, but Grandpa has. And Henry leaves, and his phone starts pinging, and it's like animals, and it's like going off constantly. So like he doesn't check it, but then all of a sudden, this is so creepy, this woman shows up, and then she like turns around, and he like is looking through the back of the house at him, and just like smiles. And I was like,
no,
what? Like, first of all, why are you in my backyard? Like, why was that the first place she went? Why did the front door is available?
Right.
And so she's like a Detective Palmer, and she's like, can we talk? No. But she's basically like, I wanted to see if you wanted to talk about the case. Like, no. I mean, you came to my house. I don't...
Right.
And she was like...
Can you give me a call?
Yeah, like, why are you in my backyard, creepy lady? But she's basically like, you know, I've known everything about this case since I was 12 and a half, and I live nearby, and I just wanted to see if you remembered anything new. So he tells her about the dream, and she asks, like, who does he think did it? And he says, the Hawthorne Institute. And she's like, the grounds weren't searched because basically Billy's trail ended like a mile away from there. And she says it also had a fence that was supposed to be secure. And he says, well, it wasn't. Like, we were able to get through. And she says, yeah, but you didn't tell anybody that till now. So, like, we probably would have searched it back then if you would have told somebody that, which is true.
Yep.
And he's like, so what does the Institute do? And she's like, research. And he says, well, then maybe it was a serial killer. And she's like, basically, I've talked to every serial killer that's ever been caught in the area, and none of them have ever claimed his murder. And also, like, she's like, basically, it was either like a one-time person or like it's somebody that's in the area, like somebody else. And she makes him realize, like, do you realize that you didn't wake up to Billy, like, screaming or anything? Like, he left willingly and he followed whoever cut the tent. And this is when I made my first suspicions, my first guesses. So we go back in time, and Billy is basically, like, he's very interested in the paranormal. So he doesn't, like, believe in ghosts, but he does wish that they were real, and so he wouldn't feel so alone. Mm-hmm. And he wants to see one for himself so that he knows that they're real, and he knows, like, where to go to do it, he believes. Back in present time, Ethan is, like, dozing on the couch, and his phone pings, and it's just, like, a raccoon, but then it goes off again, so he doesn't check it. And he remembers when Billy's parents moved out and how he thought it was his fault. But when they left, Billy's mom brought him this ghost book that Billy, like, was in love with, and that he, like, the librarian had gave it to Billy because he checked it out so many times. And it goes off, the camera goes off again, and this time it's Mr. Wallace. And he looks super confused, and he's like, did you see him? Did you see the boy? And he's basically like, he tells Ethan, like, I saw him and I followed him over here. And Ashley shows up and she's like, I'm coming to get my dad. And he starts saying, like, I know what I saw. He's out there. And Ashley's like, let's go. And she's like, Ethan, can you help me, like, get my dad home, basically. And so Henry starts asking Ethan, like, who is Billy or whatever. And Henry also asks Ethan, like, do you think I'm weird? And in his mind, he's kind of like, I mean, yeah. But he's like, does it really matter if I think you're weird? So he goes, like, and he, like, helps Henry, like, get ready for bed or whatever. And he goes downstairs and, like, he is drinking some wine with Ashley. And she asks, like, if he and his wife, had any kids or had wanted kids. And he says, well, my wife did. And Ashley... or his wife did, but he didn't. And Ashley's like, I could see that. And he thinks back on the argument he had with Claudia. And Ashley says, like, I understand, and, like, knows, like, the reason that he didn't want kids obviously was because of what happened to Billy. And Ashley says, Henry's father actually doesn't even know he exists. So Ashley, like, basically moved to LA because she was trying to make it in the music business. And she basically became, like, this super party girl, stayed drunk all the time, and ended up getting pregnant and does not know who the father is. So back in July 94, Ashley is, like, trying to play the guitar, saying, like, how she hates it here and, like, she can't wait to leave. And she hears, like, the moms talking, and she's, like, hanging out with her friend, and they're talking about Johnny dying. And she knows that, like, Ethan watches her, and she actually kind of likes him, even though he's younger than her, and she babysits him. And they talk about how there's a party tonight, and there's a guy there who she likes, Steve, and she thinks, like, how boring, like, the mom's life is here, and she doesn't want that life for herself, and, like, she wants her life, like, to be, like, a little messy, but not like Courtney Love messy, but, like, just a little bit. And her mom tells her, like, aren't you late for work? But or aren't you late for work? And she realizes, oh, like, she's supposed to be babysitting Ethan, so she runs over there. But that's when obviously his mom is home, and she's like, oh, I'm so sorry, like, I forgot to tell you. And of course, like, she's like, dang, because she was banking on this money all summer. Otherwise, she probably could have got a different job. And so Ethan's mom is like, I'll let you know if we need you for anything. And then she just starts crying, saying, like, I got fired and I feel useless. So, like, Ethan's mom is, like, breaking down crying to this teenage girl. So back in present time, Ethan is, like, testing out the garage lights, seeing, like, how fast do they trigger, how fast do they turn off. And he's reviewing some of the videos from his camera, and he sees that there's a shadow in the far corner of the woods, and it's, like, a shorter person. So he goes to his room, and he's pretty much avoided his own bedroom since he's been home. He's been staying in his parents' room. But he goes in there and he grabs the ghost book. And Billy had circled a section in there called Shadow People, and he's like, he had circled it and said, like, this is real. So he's like researching them, and there's like lots of different categories of shadow people. Some of them attack people, some of them are harmless. And he researches them, and he starts to think that maybe like Billy's around because he has like some unsolved business, finding out who killed him. And it just so happens to be like this time when they're all back in the neighborhood. So he calls Claudia again because she's the only one that he could talk to about this stuff, but she doesn't answer. And then his phone pings and he doesn't see anything. So he goes outside and he sees another ball rolling towards him. And this is the ball from his childhood for sure. So we go back to July 94, and he sees his mom downstairs crying with Ashley. And Ashley is like, hey, go outside. I'll be out there shortly. And so while he's out there waiting, Russ comes up, and he was like, I'm going to go over to Billy's. And he takes Russ, even though he knows Billy won't want him to bring him. And Billy says, we're going to go explore the woods because he knows, Russ's parents absolutely will not want him to go. But Russ agrees, and he's like, I'm going. And Ethan can't tell what it is, but something's different with Billy today. So back in present time, Ethan is looking at a satellite map of the neighborhood and the institute and everything, and he's looking up the Hawthorne Institute, and he's reading this bio about how allegedly the institute dabbled in the occult, and he's reading about Hawthorne Farms, which is basically what it's been turned into now. It's kind of like a venue for weddings and stuff like that. And he thinks back on how they had left Billy at the institute that day for 4 to 5 hours, and they didn't talk because they were mad at each other that night, and he basically wants to go back to where they had left Billy. So he looks up articles about Billy and the institute, and he ends up finding out that Bagesh actually went there as a student intern with Russ's brother Johnny, and he finds that to be really weird that this secret institute had 2 student volunteers one time, and then it never happened again. So we go back to 94, and Bagesh is sitting, holding this joint that Johnny had given him before he died, but he can't smoke it because he knows once it's gone, it's it's real, and that his best friend is dead. So he was best friends with Johnny, and basically he is thinking about how one day he had asked Johnny if he could taste the taste of weed. And so instead of just letting him smoke, Johnny had basically kissed him. And he thought okay, he's not really kissing me, but then he had kind of grabbed his head and was really kissing him, and he was like, dude, what are you doing? And Johnny's like, oh, I didn't mean it, it's just the weed or whatever. But then 6 months later, Johnny is dead, and he wishes he was here to tell him it's okay, that you like guys. And he wonders was it his reaction to Johnny that made him overdose? And so he's sitting here doing all that, thinking about all this, and he hears voices in the woods, and he goes and calls their names, and it's basically it's the boys. It's Russ, Billy, and Ethan. And he's start picking on them, but then Ashley comes up and she's like, hey, don't pick on them or whatever. And Ashley comes out there and she's telling Ethan, hey, I told your mom I would look after you today. All Bagesh is thinking is how he wishes that he could get turned on by Ashley, because he's basically realizing that he likes guys too. And so him and Ashley start talking about the party that's later tonight, and he's like, we could go together, and she's like, ew, no. And he's like, why? Is it because I'm picking on the boys? And she's like, partly that, and partly because you were a peeping Tom in my backyard. And he's thinking I wasn't looking at her, I just was sitting in the backyard. And he was like, but I was sitting back there thinking about Johnny, and I can't tell her that, so he just doesn't say anything. He lets her think whatever. And so everyone's asking Billy where are we going? And as they're walking, they're getting ready to cross the road, and Billy almost gets hit by a car because he just backs out into the road. And so back in present time, Ethan is out in the woods now, and he keeps hearing a noise, and it sounds like someone is trying to walk in sync with him. So back in 94, Ethan is trying to get Billy to turn around, but he is no, I want to keep going. But he knows he's not really supposed to be in the woods either, but he doesn't want to back out, so he just keeps following. And Ashley asks him are you okay? Do you want to go back? But he's trying to play it cool, so they keep going. So they reach the wall, the fence around the institute, and they hear water, and he's like, how does Billy even know where to go? But Billy and Russ, all of a sudden now they seem to be best buds, and now he's starting to feel left out. And now they reach the falls and they can see the Institute, and Bagesh is basically telling them how like they do research there and they talk to ghosts there. So back in present time, Ethan finds like the place that they go through the wall, and all he can think about is how like Billy was literally here this whole time and like we didn't know it. And he thinks how he doesn't think he's being followed anymore, but then his phone pings and he sees on it Henry with a piece of paper, and it says, "Hi, Mr. Marsh." And he thinks of the message he left Claudia last night. He texts her and he says, "Walking in the woods, thinking of you." He reaches the spot where he's like been avoiding, and he thinks like this is the place where I betrayed Billy. And then back in 94, Billy tells Bagesh to like prove it about the ghost or whatever. So he leads them to this mausoleum, and Bagesh tells Billy like you should go inside, and he says, "I will if Ethan will." And Ethan's like, "Absolutely not, because I'm not going in there." And Russ is like, "Well, I will," or whatever. So then Billy like kind of looks embarrassed for Ethan because now it looks like he's like some like little crybaby or whatever. So of course he's like, "Fine, I'll do it." So they all go, the three of them go inside, and there's like this slab in there that says like Elsa Hawthorne, so Ezra's wife. And they're like looking around, and then Bagesh literally locks them inside. So Ashley gets pissed, obviously, and she's trying to get them out. And then like, so they try to open it, and now the freaking thing won't open. So now they're locked inside. So they start panicking. So Russ is like this little puny kid. So he slides right out. And then Ethan is like bigger than him, but he's able to like, you know, turn his head to the side and he's able to get out. But Billy is the biggest of all of them, and he cannot get out. And as he's trying to get out, they hear somebody come up and he's like, "Hey, I told you not to come back here," or whatever. And they literally run and leave Billy. So back in present time, you know, Ethan's walking up to the mausoleum. Now there's a lock on that gate, and he sees that Ezra is now buried inside as well. And it's like not a well cared for mausoleum, which is like surprising since he spent all this money on this place. But he's like walking around, and then he sees someone like pop up, and they're like, "Whoever you are, please leave. You're not supposed to be here." And he's like, "Oh, I'm sorry. I just wanted to see your facilities." And it's like a lady, and she's like, "Well, how did you even get in here?" And he's like, "My Uber dropped me off at the gate." And she's like, "Well, we're closed." And he's like, "Well, I mean, I'm here. Could you like give me a tour?" So she's like, "Fine," or whatever. And he's like, "Well, I'm Ethan Smith." Like, and he's like, "That was stupid. I should have gave my name." But she like takes him inside, and like he sees all these pictures, and he sees pictures of Johnny with Ezra, and it's just like shocking. So he's like snapping pictures, and then he hears the lady say like, "Well, he's down there." And then Bagesh comes up and he's like, "You're coming with me." Like, obviously she called the police. So back in 94, Ashley is like dragging Ethan away as Billy is literally like crying out like, "Please don't leave me." And like, so this is how we know that he got it. So basically he must have went like the day before. That guy, like the groundskeeper, caught him and told him not to come back. And now he's here again. And the man is like, and that's what the man says to him. So back in present time, Bagesh is basically telling Ethan like, you know, "She thought you were robbing the place. Like, why are you here?" And Ethan's just like, "So what's up with the volunteer stuff?" And he tells Ethan like about Billy's body. He's like, Billy had fractures on his ribs and his skull, possibly blunt force trauma, and his remains were also wrapped in a blanket. And Ethan just keeps asking about the Institute, and basically Bagesh tells him like, "Look, I was like a guinea pig. Johnny signed us up." And he's like, "You know, we sat in this all white room with these old stuffy guys. That was a partition between me and Johnny, and they asked us to sit there and guess what was on these cards that we couldn't see, and that there were 50 cards, and we never learned if we got them right or wrong, and then we went home." And he says like, "I never went back, but like Johnny seemed to like the place, so he did." And Ethan like looks at the pictures again, and Johnny kind of looks uncomfortable, and he asks like, "Do you think what happened to Johnny is because of the Institute?" And Bagesh just like slams on the brake, and he's like, "Do not involve Johnny in like whatever you've got going on." And he asks Bagesh like, "What do you think about the man that everyone like claimed they saw in the neighborhood?" And he's like, "The guy that they saw in the neighborhood in the camouflage was me." Because like the guy, they basically said that there was some guy in camouflage walking around, and he's like, "That was me." He was like, "I was running in the woods, and I got turned around, and I got lost, and I didn't want to admit it to anyone. Like, it was me." And he's like, "You know, I always like to wear camo." And Ethan's like, "Well, why were you even in the woods that day?" And he's like, "I like to sit out there and clear my head." And he's like, "Ashley thought I was a peeping Tom, and I was just out there like clearing my head." Ethan basically mentions like, "Well, you know, like Ashley is single now." And Bagesh goes, "Well, I don't think my husband would approve." So he did end up with a husband after all of that. So Ethan asks like, "Well, how did your parents, you know, take you coming out basically?" And he's like, "Well, not well at first, but then they came around And like he's been married for 8 years now, and he actually apologized to Ethan to how he kind of bullied them when they were younger. He says he was just going through a lot of things. And Ethan is still like looking through all the pictures he took at the Institute, and there's basically pictures like of all these people going back lots of decades, and they're super weird, and they're all wearing these like black robes. And there's a picture of like Ezra with this like crystal ball, and his eyes are rolled back in his head. And then there's a picture that's different because there's 2 women in it, and one of them is his mother.
His mother.
So we go back to 94 to Joyce, and we learn that she basically had got tired of being a stay-at-home mom with the only job taking care of her husband. So she took the first job she could get, which was at the Institute. And she thought it was weird, but she liked it. She was told not to ask any questions, but she did find like a bunch of like odd symbols and tattoos. And basically that night when she had run back to the office, she had basically bought her husband a watch. Because for the first time she had her own money that was separate, and she wanted to get her husband a gift. But she had been hiding it at the office, and she forgot it. So she went back, and when she got back, she basically stumbled upon this like satanic looking ritual with what looked to be a human heart, which we learn is an animal heart that Ezra was like holding up in the woods with hooded figures. I don't know. And Mr. Vanderveer also worked there, and he was like her direct boss. So he basically put her to the side and was like, gonna have to let you go, sign this NDA. And, basically she went home, took the watch, and sold it, and never even got to give it to her husband. And so that's kind of what happened. So she was not having an affair, even though her husband has probably thought about that for the last 30 years. So back in present time, Ethan is wondering, okay, what's up with my mom? So he calls them, and he tells them, they found Billy, and he's like, look, I'm only going to ask this once. Did either of you do anything to Billy? And his mom is a little defensive, but his dad's like, look, like, it's okay. Like, he's perfectly fine asking these questions. And so they say no. And then he asked about the Institute, and she said, like, I didn't really know much. She tells him, like, I saw something one night, and that's why I got fired. And she's like, I don't really know what I saw, but it was a ritual, and she doesn't know like what kind or what happened. She's like, I saw a heart on a plate, and Ezra picked it up and held it over a fire. And that's when she asked, like, Mom, who was your boss? And that's when we learned it was Mr. Vanderveer, and his part is coming shortly. So we go back to 94. We go to Billy, and he's like, I cannot believe that he left me. And he basically had been exploring the forest since last year when Johnny had told him what they do at the Institute. And so the man tells him, like, you're in trouble now. So he had asked Johnny, like, is it haunted? Are there ghosts? And he's like, not in the way that people think. He says, ghosts come here to talk. And so he had found a way in through the wall. And as soon as he got across, he had kind of been disappointed because it wasn't spooky at all. And then that man had saw him and told him to get out. And so the man basically leads him to the Institute. And he went from being scared to kind of being intrigued. Because he takes him and he's like, we got to figure out what to do with you. So he takes him into an office, and he takes him to Mr. Vanderveer. And we go back to Ethan, and he goes back to his parents' house. Or he goes to Mr. Vanderveer's house. And his wife answers the door, and he asks, for Mr. Vanderveer. So he goes in, and he's like, hey, you want something to drink? And he's like, no, I want to know, was Billy the intended target, or was I? And Mr. Vanderveer's like, I do not know what you're talking about. And Ethan says, yes, you do. Just like you knew his body was on the estate. And he like kind of like blanches, and he's like, say what now? And he tells, he's like, my mom told me. And he's like, well, she shouldn't have, because that NDA didn't have a date on it. And he basically accuses him and Hawthorne of killing Billy. And he wants to know the truth. And Mr. Vanderveer says, like, the Institute worked in paranormal psychology, basically. He says, Ezra was born a stillborn, but like was able to come back or something like that, whatever. And so basically he always felt like some attachment to the other side. So he had this obsession with like death in the other side. And basically he says, like, your mom saw something she wasn't supposed to, and now she's held a grudge against me for the last 30 years. And Ethan's like, I don't think it's a grudge. I think she's afraid of you. And Ethan asks, like, was it a satanic ritual? And Mr. Vanderveer says, like, no, they really believed in, like, all religions. And he's like, look, I was just, like, an administrator there. Like, I just paid the bills and, like, pushed papers. And so Ethan asks about Johnny, and basically Mr. Vanderveer says Ezra really thought that he would be his protege, but Johnny was trouble. And that's really because he was struggling with his sexuality. So back in 94, Mr. Vanderveer, whose name is Fritz, by the way, he basically told Billy, like, when he brought him in, that if he wants to, like, wander around the property, he just needs to ask. And basically, like, he just shows him, like, different, like, books and talks about ghosts with him or whatever, and tells him he can come back anytime. So back in present time, Mr. Vanderveer tells Ethan, like, like, he does believe that if Ezra was still alive, that they would be able to contact Billy, but, like, obviously they can't. He basically says, like, the only thing that's stronger to keep us here than unfinished business is a grudge. So back in 94, Ethan is, like, worrying, like, if Billy is okay, because he wants to go back and get him. And so, like, the gang, like, basically they run, and then they all, like, kind of reconvene, and, like, they're like, should we go back? But Ashley's like, no, like, we can't go back. And Ashley's like, they're not going to do anything to him. Like, it'll be fine. And, like, they kind of decide, like, should we tell his parents? But they're all like, nope, like, we shouldn't say anything. We'll just all be quiet. Which I'm like, dang, like, what if he, like, never came back? Like, what the heck? Like, it was crappy. That was crappy to do. So, present time, Ethan wakes up, but this time the dream was, like, longer. And he saw something different.
Jesus.
That's scaring the crap out of me. So this time his dream was like, it's like he saw something different. Like, you know how you see something in your dream, but you can't, like, remember what you saw? Like, so he's starting to, like, get that feeling. And so he goes to write something down with his pen, but it's missing. Because basically he keeps, like, his pen and his notebook right by his bed to write stuff down. And then he finds his pen and his notebook, and there's writing in it, but it's not his handwriting. And it says, Hakuna Matata, dude, which is what Billy said to him all the time. So he goes over to Russ's house, and he is not home. But they have a spare key that his parents had left with Russ's mom and everything in case something ever happened. And they're like, well, the key is still here. Like, no one was in our house. No one, like, broke in. We set an alarm at night. All this stuff. And so Detective Palmer shows up, and she's like, I heard you were at the Institute last night. Like, what's going on? And he does believe, like, what Mr. Vanderveer said, like, that, they basically didn't do anything to Billy. But it wouldn't make sense to expose his body, like, in the same place that he was last seen. So, like, he still is, like, questioning everything. And she tells him, like, well, I could charge you with, like, meddling with a crime scene. And he's like, look, I just want to know who took Billy. And she says, like, well, you were right there. And he's like, I was asleep. And she says, I think you're just repressing a memory because you find it to be traumatic. She says it's only one possible person, only one person that could slice through a tent and still not scare him. His mother. So we jump over to Billy's mom in 94, and all she can do is worry and worry about her kids because she just thinks how the world is getting crazier and crazier. And she mentions how, like, OJ allegedly killed his wife, and is worried that, like, when she watched the police chase on TV, how he was just going to drive that Bronco all the way to New Jersey and take her kids. And she thinks about Russ's family, the Chins, and Johnny's death. And she talks about how Billy came back that afternoon after they left him, and she doesn't know that part, and he just seemed upset, and how he's probably upstairs right now with that ghost book that he doesn't think that his mom knows about the book because she doesn't like him, like, looking at that kind of stuff, but he's like, she knows that he has the book. But she lets him keep it because his dad was like, let him keep the book, basically. And she knows that Billy's always been different than the other kids, and she worries, like, too much. And she just feels like she's just worried about him sleeping over at Ethan's tonight. And she thinks about how, like, she was given this porcelain doll when she was a girl, and that's when she learned what fragile meant, and she, like, goes upstairs and just, like, smashes it, and she feels like her worries are gone. So back with Ethan, he just doesn't believe that it was Billy's mom. Like, he remembers how she grabbed him and was, like, shaking him, asking him to remember, and how, like, she just never got over it, and how that's basically how she ended up institutionalized, and, like, Billy's dad ended up dying a few years after she ended up in the institution. And Detective Palmer says, well, unfortunately, you know, regardless, her condition isn't great, so we're not even able to question her. So she leaves, and he goes and compares the handwriting that is in this book to some of the handwriting in the ghost book, and it's not an exact match. So he goes to Russ's store, and he's like, I'm going to buy a tent. He's going to face his fears. So he buys a tent. He puts it in the exact same place in the backyard that they had their tent that night. And he grabs a pillow and a sleeping bag and a notebook in case Billy wants to write something again. And he grabs some Scrabble pieces to communicate with the dead. And some bourbon. And so he sits there and he starts to think back on that night and how he was set, like, basically he went out to the tent that night not thinking that he didn't know if Billy was going to show up, basically. And then he hears something and his phone, like, pings. And so we go back to July 94 and he's in the tent. He decided to go inside and he tells his parents, you know, he's going to go out there. He wasn't sure if Billy was still stuck in the mausoleum or not. But when he came out, Billy was just standing there waiting. So he checks his phone, present time, and the ping was just a deer. But then it pings a bunch of times, and he, like, starts to see something, and then all of a sudden he hears Mr. March, and it's just Henry. So Henry comes in, and then Ashley comes too, and Ethan goes to talk to her, and she, like, looks at him and is like, why are you camping, like, after what happened? And he's like, you know, I'm hoping this will jog my, like, memory on who killed Billy. And he says, like, you know, he basically tells her, like, everything that's been going on or whatever. And so Ashley tells him, well, you know, I came over to ask if you would want to come over for dinner. Like, my dad's getting worse. So she basically, like, you know, my dad's getting worse. He's asking for my mom, who's been dead for years. And I was hoping, like, you know, to just kind of take my mind off of that and get a break from everything. But then I came over here and found you like that. So, like, that's not really a break from everything. And Ethan says, like, well, who else will be doing all these things? Like, only, like, me and Billy, like, you know, did this stuff and said this stuff. And she's like, maybe it's you. And he's like, you think I have something to do with it? And she's like, no, like, I think might be, like, a form of grief. Like, you're, like, doing these things without realizing it. And she says, I know what happened to Claudia, Ethan. And this was the biggest part of this entire story to me. She says, I know she died. I literally put, mic drop, what the F? I did not expect that. So, basically, Ethan and Claudia were married for like 17 years. And all of a sudden, she decided she wanted to have kids. And so they had a fight, and she left to cool off. And she didn't come home afterwards because they found her in her car, dead. She had basically parked at a lake, and she had just died of an aneurysm. And it's so sad because he had sent her like a message basically saying, like, come home. I want to have a kid. Like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. This I was not expecting. I teared up.
I just thought she was ignoring him.
Yeah.
Like,
I thought, like, they really went at it and she's really mad.
Yeah. Or they divorced and she just wants him to leave her alone. Or
she's has a new life, you know.
Yeah. He's got too much trauma and she just can't deal with it.
She doesn't have life anymore.
Yeah. And, like, in the book, like, it says, like, the reason that he's in his parents' house is because, like, they knew he was going through a hard time. So, like, yeah, like, your wife put you out.
Right.
Like, not my wife died.
Mm-mm.
Like, your best friend disappears right up under your nose. You go through life, you have no one except for your parents, and then one day you get this wife. And then, this broke my heart. That broke my heart.
And the saddest part is that he keeps
calling and texting her. And that he was like, let's do it. Like, let's just do it. Like, forget it.
Breaks my heart.
It broke my heart so bad.
Yeah, this is a sad element that the others that I've read don't.
Yeah, this
really
was different. Yeah, that was. My heart went out to him. I was like, oh my gosh. So yeah, so Claudia, he's been contacting. I mean, so she's no longer with us. So that's essentially why he agreed to even come back, because he's been avoiding his parents' house this whole time. But the loss of Claudia was so much greater than the loss of Billy. So, like, that was the first time that something was greater than that loss of Billy that would push him to even come back here. And so Ashley tells him, like, I think that if you believe Billy can come back, then you think that Claudia can come back. And she says, maybe this Billy thing is to let you know, like, it's time to let go. So Ashley and Henry leave, and he goes in the house and he grabs Claudia's things. And so he grabs her purse first. He charges her phone and he reads the messages he sent to her. He listens to the last voicemail he sent to her before she died, which is where he said, like, I don't know where you went. Come home. I love you. And I was like, my heart is breaking. And what he exactly said was, if having a baby makes you happy, then let's do it. Let's have a baby. I'm not going to keep letting Billy hold me back. I am unwell. I am sobbing. And so he calls and he basically starts talking for hours to do his like final goodbye. Then he just deletes her contact out of his phone, and he goes and he sleeps in the tent. So he wakes up again to the same sound from his dream, and he gets a pinging from his camera, and he looks for his notebook, and it's gone. And now there's just a piece of paper, and there's papers all over the yard, and they all say Hakuna Matata, dude. And he checks his app, and there's like nothing. So whoever did this or whatever did this did not set off the camera or avoided the camera or whatever it is. And we go, and today is now July 15th. So it's a year to the day, 30 years. And he's like, I need to relive the dream. So we go back to 94, and so Billy shows up, and they don't really talk, but they play Uno. And Ethan keeps thinking about apologizing, and he can tell that Billy's different. And he asks Billy what happened, but he's not really giving any details. And then he finally tells him, like, I went to the Institute. And then Billy says, like, I can't believe that you left me. And Ethan says, like, well, that's what you get. Like, why did you want to go there in the first place? And then he just, like, kind of snaps on Billy. He's like, why do you have to be a weirdo all the time? And he tells Billy, if you like Go so much, why don't you go be one? So then back with Ethan in present time, he calls Detective Palmer, and he basically says he wants her to cut the tent when he's asleep to see if it, like, jogs his memory. So she gives him some sleeping pills so that he can actually sleep. And he wakes up from the dream, and he thinks, like, no, it can't be him. And he wakes up, and he runs over to the Chin's house, and Russ answers, and he says, it was you. It was always you. So we go to 94 to Russ, and he thinks, like, I'm tired of being excluded. He wants to destroy that tent, and he takes the kitchen knife. So in present time, we're with Ethan, and he looks at Russ, who looks guilty, and he just tackles him. And so Detective Palmer has to, like, try to separate them. Oh, and so Russ is like, I didn't kill him. And he says, I just slashed the tent and I walked away. And he's like, I didn't say anything because I felt guilty because whoever walked by that tent that night had an easy opening because I cut it. And I don't even know what happened to the knife. He's like, I put it on the counter and the next morning it was gone. And his mom comes down the stairs and says, I hid it. So back in 94, we are with with Russ's mom. And basically, since Johnny had died, she was like, on alert. So she moves out of the room with her husband. She's like very observant to her remaining son. And she hears her son sneak out that night. And so she hears him when he comes back. She sees the knife and she didn't know what exactly he did, but she buried it in the garden. So back in present time, like the Chins and the police, like they all drive off, and Ashley comes out and she's like, do you know where Henry is? And he's like, no, like I thought he was with you. And he checks on the camera and he sees that Henry was going into the tent. So they go to find him. But as they approach, they realize that they're too late because Henry is not in the tent anymore. And so he checks the camera and he sees a dark hooded figure go in the tent and grab Henry. And they realize it is Billy's brother. And now he knows why Ashley's brother kept saying, and I did write it here, the Behringer boy. Because he didn't say Billy. He kept saying, I'm seeing the Behringer boy. Mm-hmm. And there's two of them. And so he was seeing him. He just wasn't seeing Billy. And his name is Andy.
Yeah, Andy, I think. So.
And so he's like, I know where they're going. So they head toward the falls. And they see him holding Henry by the falls. And Henry's hands are bound. And Andy basically says, like, you don't know what it's like to lose your older brother and someone you love and look up to. And Ethan says, I do. I can relate. You don't have to do this. And he says, like, I took Henry because I need you to remember. And Ethan says, I do, like, just let him go. And he says, I need you to know the rest. And he says, I think someone else killed Billy. And he's like, I was there. I was outside the tent and I heard everything that you said to him. So we go back to 94, and basically Andy was standing outside because he wanted to tag along with his older brother. And he heard him and Ethan arguing. And so back with Ethan, he said, I spent my life wondering, or basically like thinking about all those terrible things that he had said to Billy, like the last thing he said to him. And basically he realizes, like, Andy thinks I killed him. And he's like, Andy goes, maybe this will make you confess. And he literally goes to like haul Henry over the edge. And Ashley screams and she goes, it was me. And I go, I knew it.
I did not.
Something was, so, and then I said the next part, which I was definitely correct about, because I knew how she did it. But anyways, so I go, I knew it. And so Ethan turns to her and is like, don't, like, admit to something you didn't do. And she's like, I'm not, it was me. So we go back to Billy's POV. And basically, he knew that he and Ethan could not go back to being close friends that night after what had happened between them that day. And so he basically, he had turned over. He said the whole Hakuna Matata dude. He turned over, but he basically cried himself to sleep. He woke up and he saw Russ slash the tent. And he thought it was a ghost. So he didn't see Russ. He saw the tent get slashed, but he thought it was a ghost. So he walked toward the forest and he planned on going to the Institute. And he was just barefoot. He was just vibing. And then we get that there was a girl driving. She had no license. It was late. And she had had some drinks. And we go back to present time. And Ashley says it was an accident. And I'm so sorry. And I thought it was a deer. She says, I got out and I sat there for an hour just waiting on another car to come as she like held him. And she said, I knew that my life was over and that Billy's was already over. So when no one came, she just carried him to the falls. She told her dad that she had hit a deer. She says, do whatever you want to me, but not my son. I'm so sorry. And Henry looks at his mom and is just like disgusted. And Henry, like, she tries to reach for Henry, but because he is disgusted, he like jerks back and he falls into the falls. And Ethan just jumps in after him. So he jumps in and he is like trying, he doesn't know which way is up. And he's trying to find him and he feels like a tug. He thinks that he's grabbed Henry, but it's Billy. And so he is able to get Henry and they're able to get out. And when they get out, Henry asks him, Mr. Marsh, did that boy help you? And he says, yes, but that's my friend Billy. So we jump ahead to December 31st, 2025. So a little futuristic. And Ethan is relaxing at home, which is his parents' home, which is now officially his home. He took the camera down because after all of the events of everything unfolded, there was just a lot of traffic in the backyard. And basically everyone has moved out of the neighborhood now, and he is the last one standing. So the Wallaces moved out, then the Vanderveers, then the Chins. And Ethan is now raising Henry because Ashley did go to prison, and she asked him to raise Henry. But he's actually forgiven her. I mean, it is just a series of unfortunate events. Andy was not charged for abducting Henry because Ashley asked them not to charge him. But Ashley got 2 10-year sentences and at the least will do 8 years. So Henry will probably be grown when she gets out. So he went ahead and officially adopted him. And at the end of it, Henry calls him dad and he is reading Billy's ghost book. The end.
Elfine.
All right, what did you rate this?
5 stars.
Yes. I think I gave it a 4.5. It is sad. Like, it's just a series of unfortunate events. Like, yeah. It's just like Billy just like didn't fit in, and so like that whole like, oh, like my ghost friends are coming for me, and then we talked about this in book club, and then like the foreshadowing of him getting. That's why I knew he got. I don't know how I knew it was. I figured it was Ashley, Bagesh, or Russ, and then like when they were pointing at them too heavily, I knew it wasn't them. But then I knew that she hit him with the car because it was that scene where she pulls up in the car, and then the foreshadowing when they're walking and he almost gets hit by the car.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, he was just like vibing with his ghost friends. And then it's just like, now she has this
and
kid.
he feels connected to this place.
Yeah.
Because, you know, they
are like him. Like,
yeah.
They are relate to him, which, I mean, I guess now he's always here, so.
Yeah. I wish that, I mean, now thinking about it after book club, I wish that there would have been like a false, accusation or false, like, lead to Ashley. Yeah. And then it ended up coming back to Ashley. Like, something that kind of, oh, well, maybe not.
Yeah, she didn't really have any fake outs. Yeah. There was never anything about her that was, like, made her even look guilty to, like, fake her out. But, yeah, I was just like, aw, it's just touching. But, yeah, that thing about his wife, like, that was honestly the worst part of the whole thing. Like, that was it. Like, I mean, the rest of that stuff, yeah, but, like, that was heart-wrenching. Like,
yeah, I remember, like, audibly gasping.
Yeah, my mouth
closing,
dropped.
Like, just shutting it off and being like, oh,
like,
my gosh.
My mouth dropped. I was like, oh my God. Like, that is heartbreaking.
Yeah.
This poor man, like, oh my gosh. And it's just like, now he gets to have a son, even though he doesn't have, but he is like, oh, he's also like dating at the end of the book. And like, but it's just like, you know.
It's sad.
That is sad. And like, she was the only one that ever kind of connected with him. But
so far, this is my favorite Riley Sager.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which this is only for the fourth book of his that I've read. But I really, really, really enjoyed this one.
So, do we have reviews?
Yes. And the 5-star review that we're going to do is mine.
Ah.
Because I was just I was a little proud of my review. I'm only reading half of it, so one of the 2 paragraphs. I knew it. I knew I would not guess the turn this book would take. Thrilled I was to get approved to read middle of the night, as I knew I would be in for a wild ride that would ensure I wouldn't walk away unharmed. Now I sit here in front of my computer wondering if I should call the ambulance because the whiplash Sager gave me while reading this book is unreal. I left many notes along the way, hoping that one of the theories that I tossed out would catch something, but alas, in the end, I had nothing but the aforementioned whiplash. And for our favorite part of the podcast, the 1-star review. Mr. Sager, what you've just written is one of the most insanely idiotic things I've ever read. At no point in your rambling, incoherent narrative were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having been subjected to it. I award you no stars, and may God have mercy on your soul. I feel personally victimized by that because...
May God have mercy on your soul.
I loved this book. But to each their own, I guess.
May God have mercy on your soul is deep. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, to each their own, like you said. Yeah, well, okay. So our next read is Razorblade.
Yes,
okay.
I'm excited about that one too.
Yeah, so our next read is Razorblade Tears by S.A. Cosby. So we are back with him again. I'm excited not to read. I mean, I am excited, but I feel like everyone's like, it's so gut-wrenching.
Razorblade Tears is my favorite of his.
Okay.
It does feel similar vibes to Blacktop Wasteland.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I like that.
I love this one though. Like, and it's very, I don't know, something about revenge. Just.
I like a revenge. I do like a revenge. Yeah, so that is our next book. So looking forward to that, and then I think that wraps up September. So yeah. Then we're moving on to spooky season. Woo woo. All right. Well, that is all we have for today. So we will talk to you guys next time.
Bye.
Bye.